Hello, listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, podcaster, poet, and freelance proofreader. As I said last episode, the stuff with the Colossal Titan was great. But the scene with the Attack Titan, I was losing my ever-loving mind. I was just losing it. That whole sequence was so mother-freaking cool. It looked even more freaking amazing than it did in the Season 4 trailer, which is saying a lot because it already looked sick then in that pre-animated trailer. And I was thinking Eren was going to break the ships just like Kruger had demonstrated to Grisha, which was such an awesome sequence already from the past seasons. But nah, Eren lifted the ship and just freaking carried it onto the shore. And then while Hanja was trying to deal with the Marlians and convince them to surrender, Eren was just quietly, calmly chilling out in the background, very patient and professional, but like the most intimidating freaking bodyguard ever. I said before that all he needed were some Titan-sized sunglasses to wear in that scene, and then he could just fold his arms and have the whole bodyguard stance. And the Marlians are busy trying to argue and be defiant and honestly be outright obnoxious as well. And it's like, bruh, do you really want to be like that right now? Because that boy just came up out of the water like freaking Godzilla and carried your whole ship up here. You really want to play it like that right now? Sapphire said the whole beginning of the episode is just Eren flexing. And she is so goddamn right. That was beyond satisfying. And once again, I just felt so proud of Eren because he's both developed his abilities as a Titan shifter and he's also demonstrated this increased sense of control and maturity as a person. You get this more watchful, observant, and steady feel from him now. And I'm just so pleased with it. And I'm someone, if you've read that article I wrote about Eren's younger years, you know that I'm someone who loves the younger version of him and really feels that he deserved way more slack from the audience. Because I think he was actually more functional and less emotionally broken than many people would be if they'd gone through anywhere near the amount of acute trauma and then chronic, ongoing trauma and stress that he had to cope with. But that doesn't mean I don't also want or hope for him to grow and improve over time and maybe get better at dealing with things. I can both understand and cut him some slack because of what he's going through, and aspire to see him work on and through things over time. And I already said before how impressed and proud I was of stuff like that big fight with Reiner, after Reiner broke cover and all, where Eren not only demonstrates some sick martial arts skills, but also demonstrated his ability and willingness to listen to the team and take advice and work with them, and not just blindly keep fighting, even in the heat of battle and after such extreme emotional provocation. So just watching the way Eren is able to operate nowadays, in the undercover work, in the actual attack in Liberia, and now even during these flashbacks when he was still younger, I just want to celebrate and give him a bear hug. Seriously, props. Major props. Also, knowing a bit about something in particular he's been going through from about the time of the recognition ceremony and up to and through the present, I actually find it a bit astonishing that he, A, is not catatonic or confined to bed with extreme depression and anxiety or outright madness, B, has not taken his own life, especially since he has at least occasionally been suicidal, and C, has actually been able to continue functioning so well in his regular job as a soldier and Titan shifter, let alone take on all of this additional stuff more recently. Despite the serious cracks and damage and warping and outright sickness that are also present within Eren, there's nevertheless an aspect in which his mental strength and emotional strength are pretty staggering. That reminds me of something. Eren didn't even look worried when Levi promised to have a talk later about the withheld information, but I think most of us were probably like, cripes. I gave Levi a free pass on the airship, but he definitely needs to get out of the habit of abusing his subordinates. But I think it's an improvement that Eren doesn't seem to have the level of fear he used to when it comes to Levi. Although it could just be that he's somewhat past the point of caring by now, especially since he knows he can at least recover physically, even though it'll still hurt horribly. In fact, people have asked about this, and I'm pretty sure that Eren, even with his recovery powers, has the same level of physical sensitivity to pain as a normal person, aside from the likely exception of having more physical durability when it comes to heat due to the Titan powers, which is something Sapphire actually called. But otherwise, I think he and the other Titan shifters feel pain just as much, and he's just extremely stoic and tenacious about shaking it off and working through it. In any case, the other thing I have to say about that whole magnificent freaking scene with the attack titan is how goddarn gorgeous the animation looks there. The art quality, the movement, how the scene overall was executed. It's like what I was saying before with that exchange with Reiner at the beginning of episode 8. This is the quality of arts and other aspects that I dearly, dearly, dearly hope to see for an upcoming action sequence that I'm extremely excited about. It's such an epic and powerful sequence in terms of both the sheer kick-butt action and the emotional resonance, so it really friggin' needs an execution on par with that. Although, it'll be a pretty massive job, so I don't know how feasible that's gonna be. I'm just hoping they don't disappoint me. Oh, this is actually a neater segue than I was expecting. But speaking of animation and disappointment, this is where I talk about the mirror scene, which has had some quite mixed reactions from the fans. Ooh, actually, before I get to the animation or artwork aspect of that, I want to mention the lines and that parallel scene we see with Mikasa. A quick thank you to YouTube user Adrian Ruffner for providing the transcription of the Romaji for Eren's lines, by the way. It was interesting to see what people thought of the scene with Mikasa. I saw people interpreting it as Mikasa's trying to reconvince herself of Eren's mantra by repeating it in that scene, much as he probably is in his own scene. But I saw it pretty differently. I felt like she was actually repeating it as an expression of doubt, actually. I mean, that visual is pretty powerful and stark. She's sitting in front of the grave while talking about victory and survival. And the big thing is, in a practical sense, they won in Liberia, right? There's obviously a much larger conflict, but in that individual battle, they were able to accomplish their goals and do a great deal of damage to the enemy side. And they also sustained relatively minimal casualties on their own side, tragic though those still are. So, I think that would generally be considered a success, right? But what feeling of victory does she have sitting in front of Sasha's grave? They won, and Sasha was part of the team that won, and she was integral to that victory. Yet she still died. And Mikasa's already grown up surrounded by death and tragedy and loss, and she's used to even the successful military operations carrying a massive death toll. But I think in losing one of her closest friends there, she's thinking about the cost of warfare and of Eren's actions, and wondering if, by the end of this, the life they get, if victorious, will even feel worthwhile with what it's going to cost. What's victory really going to look like if they do manage to obtain it? Fighting is how you win, but is this win really worth it? Heck, are we actually winning in all of this? Of course, that still brings us back to the million-dollar question. Did anyone else actually have a better plan? One that was actually about to be executed? In time? Because being annihilated by Marley sure as heck wouldn't be winning. Whatever you count as victory definitely needs to be a better outcome than that. But poor Mikasa. Her pain, and maybe a bit of despair, definitely come through in that scene. And it's a sort of beautifully tragic and slightly haunting scene that they captured there. And that was definitely a great scene to have right before that transition to Eren. Oh, speaking of transitions right quick, it's kind of been indicated that what we've been hearing throughout the series was Armin narrating things to Annie. Now that whole thing throws me. You know why? I'd already figured out a while ago that Armin has been the narrator throughout the series. It was not just a coincidence that the same voice actress who does Armin's voice in the Japanese version is also the narrator. Finding out that they made sure to do the same thing with the voice actor from the English dub helps confirm that. So my theory was that having Armin as a narrator indicates that he's one of the characters who survives the events of the series and lives to pass on the story to others. But if his narration has actually been a relatively recent thing, and the voice we've been hearing is still a young Armin, not one who's talking to like his grandchildren decades later or something, then that makes me significantly more concerned about his future and his survival in the storyline. Yikes. Maybe I need to borrow Eren's lines here to Armin to fight. I'm sure my pronunciation sucks because Japanese isn't one of the languages I'm studying yet, but hopefully he would still be able to understand me. But speaking of those lines, we can talk about the mirror scenes. Next episode of the podcast. Alright guys, thanks for listening to today, and I hope you've had a great time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn notifications on so you can get updates. It can help make the podcast more visible for new viewers and listeners by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, social media, etc. Now be blessed and stay salty. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, podcaster, poet, and freelance proofreader. I'm gonna preface this by saying I've already figured out that I'm definitely gonna sound at least a little awkward here, plus that some of what I tend to say for serious reasons still comes off maybe a bit awkwardly as well. I've just resigned myself to that. It's simply gonna be one of those kinds of topics, like I referenced in my trailer reaction. Oh, speaking of the trailer reaction, you know how I had that segment talking about the whole fitness thing when it came to the cadets? And I had wondered whether any of the bodies of water within the walls provided fish for the population. Well, that was actually answered by Spiral Lifeform and Okariotu Krele Conley, a couple of folks on Reddit, in connection with this episode, since we had that whole seafood scene. And I was able to confirm what they said by checking out the reference they pointed to. The folks on Parties hadn't known what an ocean was, and definitely hadn't been using that as a source of food. But they did have some access to freshwater fish. And we know that because there's a scene in episode 1 of the first season where you can see fish in the market in Shiganshina. To be exact, I checked out the episode itself, and the fish are shown during that scene, where Eren is arguing with Mr. Hannes about the importance of taking his job as a garrison soldier seriously. So, while I don't know how commonplace or affordable fish was for them, and whether the cadets would have eaten it with any frequency, the population as a whole did indeed make use of fish as part of their diets to some extent. Okay, Eren, the famous mirror scene. There seem to be a good number of viewers who aren't happy with how that part was executed. I think I'm basically going to share what I said in a YouTube comment in response to the criticism. So, here we go. I think most of what MAPPA's artists did here was deliberate. A. He's in a dungeon with limited lighting. B. They had a blur effect on the further shots, which felt accurate to how details and edges tend to be less distinct in dim lighting like that. C. The lack of detail was mainly on the parts that were in the shadowing, based from the direction of the light. If you look at how the reflection of Eren's front looks in the mirror, it's significantly more detailed looking. D. You actually have some of the detailing on his back still in that far shot. It's just indistinct. You have to look closely. And my most important points are as follows. 1. People are understandably focused on the Tatsukai scene. But there's that first quick scene we got where there are actually killer shots that weren't even in the manga. And during that scene, we get a close-up of Eren's back, and that shot is actually highly detailed. He also has a good amount of bulk to his frame, which is also still somewhat evident in the far shot. Folks have also commented that the design and proportions currently are looking more true to life. If you look in that same scene, where they do the close-up of him first breathing against the mirror, and his wet hair is still down, you can also see some of the muscling of his shoulders and upper back, though it's hidden a bit by his long hair. But he still has both definition and real substance to the muscle. 2. There was something eerie when I first watched that scene, and I think I figured it out. I think they actually did something very clever and deliberate there with the lighting. I suddenly realized that aside from generally making the scene and setting feel dark and unpleasant, he is stuck in a prison cell, possibly a rather cold one at that, with how his breath is misting. But the lighting actually makes his body look much the same color as that of the attack titan. And once I realized that, I also noticed that the scene of having his wet hair down like that also harkened back to how the attack titan looked when it rose up out of the ocean, lifting the ship. Besides how killer that initial mirror scene looked anyways, I love it several times more now that I've realized what they were probably doing. And having that resemblance there, which has already been a theme before now and is about to continue after this point, really fits, especially with what we see in the upcoming conversation. It's just so clever if it was deliberate, and I highly suspect it was. 3. The way his eyes looked definitely caught me off guard, but I had two main thoughts there. One is that we may get more or less a repeat of that scene during the next episode, and they might show an emotional shift there. The preview for episode 10 already shows more of a spark and an anger in his eyes. And the other thought, which connects to this, is that in the manga, we mainly just had his words themselves and his expression. And since we were dealing with still frames, Isayama had to choose more narrowly regarding what would be focused on or conveyed. In the anime, we have more individual frames, plus we have the key advantage of the voice acting. When I listened to Eren's delivery, the way he said it definitely had that intensity that we didn't really see in his expression in the anime. What occurred to me is that they may have taken the opportunity to give a more nuanced or complete picture now that they had more methods they could simultaneously use to convey what's going on with them. So with his voice, they convey that heat and dogged determination and intensity. But on his face and in his eyes, we see some of the physical and mental/spiritual fatigue he actually feels. And people have various interpretations and questions regarding the mirror scene, but assuming there's nothing supernatural going on, the basic concept is probably that Eren is repeating this mantra to remind himself and sort of talk himself into continuing this extremely difficult and painful path. He's just lost a dear friend and blames himself for that, no doubt. And he also knows stuff he's going to do soon in the future. He's already suffering and exhausted, and we've already been seeing that in his eyes since episode 3, alongside the weary determination also there. And it's safe to assume that he probably wasn't allowed to attend funeral services or the like for Sasha, either. What we see here is likely his trying to get a second win. He's had time to shave and bathe, and now he's repeating this core mantra to himself in the mirror as he steels himself for the next steps of the plan. So I think what we see in the preview is that he has managed to get that second win some, shake off the fatigue and grief, and psych himself up to continue fighting. So the empty expression does still jar me, but I also like it conceptually, especially in the context of Sasha's recent death. It's actually good to show some of the strain again, and how he's having to fight through that, rather than easily shaking it off like everything's fine. I knew he still had to be suffering internally, even with how that's less evident in the manga version, but I like the idea that this is being showcased more in the anime version. 4. I've seen people comparing this against the colored manga panel. From what I understand, that is an unofficial work done by a fan artist. It looks gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it's not the original version we actually got. And as it happens, I was recently comparing the two versions, and the lighting and shadow aspects in the colored version definitely enhanced the look of Eren's musculature a lot. The actual black and white original panel also looked killer, no doubt, but probably not as aesthetically pleasing. Plus, it wasn't so easy to see the level of definition the way you could with the colored fan art. And as it is, the level of detail in a single manga frame isn't a realistic bar when you're dealing with an anime where each single frame is one of many more that have to be done. And it's even more unfair to compare it with something that's a fan art coloration and not what we actually got officially. Apologies if I'm mistaken there, but that is a fan coloration, though. In fact, come to think of it, one difference we see here is that the colored panel still has Eren wearing the lighter colored clothing that matches the Marlene military. He looks darn great in it, and seeing that spin on it is actually really cool. But even before the anime scene, it was already shown in the manga itself that the clothing he's now wearing back in Paradise is darker. He's no longer wearing his undercover outfit. So yeah, that adds to what I was thinking as far as this being fan art rather than an official coloration. And even though I love the beautiful warm lighting in that fan panel, the largely colder, darker lighting used here in the anime is probably more realistic, especially given the angle we're dealing with regarding the light direction. We get the warmer tones of light towards Eren's front in the anime, but they don't try to bathe the rest of him in that light, and it makes sense why they wouldn't. Even with what we see in the preview, he's likely facing more towards the light source, outside the cell I'm guessing, so it makes sense to now see him covered in the warmer colors more. So, I'm going to finish this topic up next episode, and that should be the last entry in the reaction to Brave Volunteers. I'll catch you there. Alright guys, thanks for listening to me today, and I hope you had a great time. If If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on to get updates. You can help make the podcast more visible for new viewers and listeners by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, social media, etc. Now, be blessed and stay salty. Hello, listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson, author, podcaster, poet, and freelance proofreader. So, we finally reached the final part of the reaction. I'll finish up addressing a couple of things regarding the mirror scene and Eren's design, and then some random notes before we close. There's more I could say, but I think I'll wrap up my discussion of the mirror scene by saying this. I'd actually been worried myself about how MAPPA would do in being able to convey Eren's crazy amount of muscle in a way where it was well defined but didn't seem exaggerated, especially with their realistic and detailed overall style. That first shot we get, with the close-up of Eren's back and then his hair and shoulders, definitely has me feeling more optimistic about their ability to handle that dilemma. I get why folks are worried about the second scene that we got at the end of the episode, and it did feel anticlimactic for me upon first viewing. But I think they largely had good reason for their approach, and I think we really need to wait until finishing episode 10 or even 11 before giving them a thumbs down on the cell sequence overall. I do hope we get a continuation of the mirror part next episode, to be clear. I'm glad we got that more exhausted look, but I also want to see the one where he's getting that energy back again. And again, I'm also very pleased with the new frames we got from MAPPA via that initial scene. Hopefully that's more what we'll generally see with stuff like this for the upcoming sequences. I definitely understand some of the problems people have with the Tatsukai scene, as it wasn't how I initially expected either, and didn't feel as powerful as I had been anticipating, although I am warming up to it some with the further analysis. But if I had to choose between having it play out as nicely as expected, but not getting those new shots, versus the option we actually got, the main part not being as we'd hoped, but having those awesome new shots and moments we didn't get in the manga, then I'd choose the latter. For me, I prefer that choice because the new stuff makes up for it enough, and we still have the awesome material from the manga itself, and even that awesome fan coloration that we shouldn't technically be counting anyways, but that people are using for comparisons. I do understand not everybody agrees about that though, although I do wish people at least noticed the upsides here. But one thing I have seen is that it seems like folks on Reddit are much happier as a whole versus the ones I'm seeing in the YouTube comments, so it's been nice to see the upbeat comments there. One thing I don't really get, though, is a particular complaint I saw on YouTube about Eren's hair. This one commenter seemed to be complaining that they hadn't left some of Eren's hair loose towards the front to sort of frame his face the way we see in the manga. It's not very visible in some of the shots, sure, but if you look at when he's breathing onto the mirror that second time, you definitely see that some of his hair is still hanging down after he's tied the rest. So that really does feel like another example of folks not actually paying attention and complaining about something that MAPPA has already shown good awareness of, just like with how some folks don't really seem to notice the other new frames. Now, I debated even bringing up that last complaint, wondering if it were too persnickety, especially since I do think it was off anyways. But I stated before, and I'm going to restate this for any new listeners here. I really want this to be a place where we can deep dive into even little details like that one, or like how I was discussing questions about the cadets' diets during my trailer reaction. Especially because I mostly see that kind of thing going on in contexts geared towards manga readers. I want my podcast to hopefully be a place where anime only or anime mostly folks can come and listen and take part in that sort of thing without having to work so hard to dodge spoilers. And, of freaking course, the manga readers are also welcome here, just as long as they can remember the request about how to handle spoiler info. That's why I take up valuable description space for it. I do have a length limit for my descriptions on my current podcast host, but I feel like that spoiler etiquette note is really important to include when I can. But with that whole detail thing in mind, and how important details often are in AOT as a series, I decided that it was reasonable to go ahead and address the hair complaint instead of just dismissing it outright. There are moments where I do get frustrated, though. I've seen folks here and there complain about a certain aspect of Eren's physique, and this is about his actual design in general, as seen in the manga and artwork. not just the anime. And oh my goodness. For a couple of different reasons, I'm not even going to specify what they were complaining about exactly, at least not yet. But the complaint itself really shows how folks are. Dude has a physique that suggests a truck ton of hard work, including during the period he was missing a freaking leg, plus that he also has something of an uncommon genetic trait, and people still find something to talk down about regarding his physique. Good freaking grief. It's starting to feel like some of the nitpicking Gabrielle Douglas had to deal with. I know you're performing world-class feats of athleticism, Gabrielle, but why isn't your hair even neater than that, even though it's already quite reasonably tidy? And like I said, that was about his manga design, but it makes me think of what the animators have to deal with too. But here's a really cool, final little positive detail to talk about as we end this off. You know what I was talking about earlier with Onyan Kapon's explanation regarding his skin color? I had thought that this character's name was a purely fictional one Isayama had come up with. Although I probably should have known better, especially after the whole thing with Helos. But as it turns out, not only is his name real, it actually sort of ties into what he said to our team. His name is actually the name of a deity from the culture of the Akana people who live in Ghana and other parts of West Africa. Huge thanks to Peku the Great for that catch. I'm really glad I was able to catch his or her name there. I don't know the names of, or I don't have the names of everyone who contributed various analyses and observations, but I do try to clarify in my podcasts when I'm referring to stuff like this that's from the discussions and thoughts of fellow fans. You know, in my coverage of this series, I really hope to bring value to the table for my listeners, and I want to make sure there's really a point to it. So my goal is to make sure my coverage goes beyond covering the basic points that are already going to be obvious to most folks, and that you're probably going to hear anyways, especially if you're like me and have multiple different reactors you're following. I still include those parts too because they are also important, and they're a huge part of the fun of reactions, like gushing over super cool, high-octane action moments, right? But I also hope to go beyond that, plus ultra, I guess, by taking additional steps too. Really working to think deeply and carefully about different elements of the storyline, plus how things are actually executed in the anime itself. B, sometimes taking time to wade into the spoiler-infested waters and read other folks' commentary and thoughts and theories and special insights, and then sharing those gems with the audience. And C, sometimes I have moments where I can catch something myself that maybe not a lot of folks will, especially not very soon. I was seriously over the moon when I suddenly connected the dots regarding that initial footage from the mirror, why it felt so eerie, and how that's actually probably a deliberate continuation of that theme, where Eren's human aspect and Titan aspect are sort of merging and bleeding into each other in several senses. Heck, even if they said later that they didn't do that, that they didn't give the scene that effect on purpose, that's still what they achieved in those shots. So it's a really happy accident, and I'm super thrilled I was blessed to have noticed that. Especially with trying to take in and consider so much extra information regarding this particular episode, because I can't do that with every single one. I'm kind of surprised I was able to eventually have that burst of clarity and focus for my own independent analysis. Phew. Praise God. Hopefully I'll continue to have moments like that, God willing. But before I sign off, another quick note with regards to character designs. This probably isn't super important narratively, although you never know with how Isayama is. But I've really been enjoying and looking forward to getting to see our characters in these various outfits now that their wardrobes are changing some. And you know, one neat trait I'd already noticed about Mikasa from the previous seasons is that, even though she can come off as a bit tomboyish sometimes, she actually likes to wear pretty feminine clothes when she has the option. And I don't think it's just a cultural thing, especially as we see how Annie tends to wear less girly outfits. And sure, Annie is Marleyan, but then so is Peak. Heck, so is Gabby. Though I guess in Gabby's case, it could mainly be a question of what her parents buy for her. Alright guys, thanks for spending time with me today, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode and the rest of the reaction. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you can get updates. And you can help make the podcast more visible for new viewers and listeners by leaving a like, share, comment, or review on whichever platform you use to listen. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, social media, etc. Now be blessed and stay salty.